My name is Geno Samuel, and welcome back to Discographies, yes, where I'm talking about every single studio album by the prog rock band Yes in chronological order, and reviewing them and describing how they were made, in a way. So, after Yes completed their Going for the One tour, they felt quite taxed in its aftermath and went on a little break before going back into the studio to work on their next project. They were working on material all throughout the tour, in fact, wanting to make fresh music rather than developing older, unused ideas. They started recording in early 1978, with recording time split between RAK Studios and Advision Studios in London. Eddie Offord made his return as an engineer at the very start of the recording sessions, but either left or was dropped after a very short involvement. The band chose to carry on again without a producer at the helm, and produced and mixed the album themselves. The recording process was strained, as band members often had issues with each other's ideas, and it was pretty much every man for himself deciding what the other should be doing, with no overseer overseeing the matter. This was an issue I felt with the end result of Going, but apparently tensions finally came to a boil on this album. Rick Wakeman introduced into his instrumentation a Polymoog and a Byrotron tape relay keyboard, which he helped fund into fruition. He also reduced the total number of keyboards in his setup, hoping that by using the same smaller set of sounds, he could help the album sound more cohesive and the songs would flow better. Though Steve Howe said the new synths clashed with his guitar work, with his guitar sound too. By the end of the recording sessions, they had well over an hour of material to work with, and I think the rest of the songs that didn't make the final cut were released as bonus tracks in the 2004 Rhino remaster and re-release. An astounding 9 bonus tracks. I must admit, it's been a while since I've listened to them, but since I can't remember the majority of it, they probably weren't that good, which meant that yes, indeed, the 8 tracks that made it onto the record were the best cuts of the crop. We'll get to those soon enough. Now, the title and album. They originally planned to call the album Yes Tour, which is the name of a high hill in Devon, in England. And this is what you see in the background of the sleeve art. Like the previous album, the cover was designed by Hypnosis, and while working on the artwork for the album that was then still called Yes Tour, they took these blue tinted photos of Yes Tour and inserted a guy using dividing rods in front of it, and a photo of the band is on the back. Legend has it, someone threw a tomato at it. And who did it depends on who you ask. According to Wakeman, he threw a tomato at it because the band were displeased with the final result of a pretty costly photo shoot and design effort. Howe said that a member of Hypnosis threw a tomato at the photo on purpose, which was insulting to him. Alan White said that Audrey Powell of Hypnosis felt frustrated with the final result, so he threw a tomato at it. And according to the band manager Brian Lane, the band was displeased with the artwork as a whole, so they all collectively threw tomatoes at it. Whatever transpired, a depiction of a splattered tomato was added onto the original photo, and Yes Tour and Tomato were combined to create Tormato. Well, I say Tormato. Some people say Tormato. So the album cover designing process was a mess, and the final sleeve art is also literally a big ol' mess. Are the actual contents of the album a mess as well? Musically, most Yes fans have big issues with this album, and is often ranked as one of their worst. Is it though? Well, let's see. The opening track, Future Times Rejoice, starts with a theme played together with guitar and one of Rick's fancy new keyboards. It jumps around without reason all over the place and kind of sounds like a poor copycat Frank Zappa lick. I can definitely remember the first bit. It's like but after that they basically wrote down a bunch of random notes here and there and learned how to play them really well. After a bit of that, the bass and drums come in. Chris Squire uses a Mutron pedal for this track and almost every track on the album. It creates a richer, more flamboyant at times sound to his bass. I think it's something like an auto wah-wah, so the effect, depending on how hard you hit the strings, it wahs more or less. The drums, dear God, it sounds like Alan is banging away on cardboard boxes, and it sounds that way for pretty much all of the album. In this track especially, it's amazing how much movement there is in the music from the guitars and synths, but it feels so empty, but still crowded. Apparently this came about because John Anderson would record an acoustic guitar backing as a guide for the song, which would then be removed, leaving all this empty space that was filled by Howe and Wakeman. Squire said that it was as if there was a competition between the two for who could play the most notes the fastest, and everybody lost. The verses take on a march-like atmosphere with the drums adopting a marching beat led by snare. And the first half of the verse melody is kind of catchy, I guess. I can't remember much of it though. Just lots of notes and word salad, really. I do know that it goes into these almost folk-like, soft acoustic-led sections. I know because when I was listening to the album a while back, I was taking notes in my notebook. It's my workflow. I take notes of what's happening so I can better remember the music and formulate emotions and opinions, and write a script for it. This sentence is in the script. This one is also in the script. Now, if I didn't take notes on this song, I probably couldn't tell you about my feelings about it, because I have an incredibly hard time remembering this song. It's kind of amazing. It sticks around for nearly 7 minutes, and it's so profoundly insignificant, leaving me with no impression of it at all except acknowledging that it happened. It has about the same emotional significance as a burp. I burp, I say excuse me, and then move on with my life. Legit, the band should have said excuse me at the end of this one. And this isn't me hating the song like The Ancient from Tales. That one left me angry and irritable. This song is probably the least impactful song they had recorded so far. One thing I can say is that in stark contrast to the reverb-laden Going for the One, this one has none of that. And that's also a problem, because now it feels too flat and lifeless. According to Brian Q, who worked on remastering other Yes albums, commented that the original tapes did not have Dolby A applied to them, which is a type of noise reduction system that Eddie Offord always used. He suggested that perhaps the engineers who worked on the album didn't know that Dolby A hadn't been applied, and once he himself applied it to the tracks, everything except the overdubs sounded suddenly amazing. Anyway, I'll move on to the next track. Don't Kill the Whale. It is what it sounds like. It's an anti-whaling song. Probably the best one ever made, even if there is more than a handful in that category. The opening is stellar, the guitar hook is good and tasty, and like within the first half a second or so, you can recognize the song. Chris is back with his wah-wee bass line. The chords accompanying the guitar line are great, they're dramatic, they make sense, and are distinctive enough, I feel, that if you heard them on their own, played by someone else, you could say, hey, that sounds like Don't Kill the Whale. Anyway, the verses are pretty solid, mostly in two-part harmony with John and Chris. Drums take on a heavier sound led by toms. The Don't Kill the Whale, take it at the end of the verse is too cool. There is no chorus really, and each verse is followed by a guitar solo, first by a half-okay one. It starts off cool, then Steve Howe does what he do and ruins it. The second one is kind of a reprise of the intro theme and is mostly nice to listen to. There is also a wacky double synth solo in which Rick Wakeman plays two solos on two instruments at once, well at least he does in the music video. But on the record at least, they go through separations and convergences, playing completely separate melodies and then rejoining to play in harmony. Pretty cool. The sounds of the keyboards are almost like a cross between strings and brass. Then they go into a new tonality introduced by a great guitar lick that sets the new groove into motion. I don't know, Steve sounds pretty good on this track. He must have been having an off day. Then the band come in with an infectious crowd-pleasing chorus chant. Some tracks of piano chords too, and I think it's a nice touch and change of sound, honestly. After a good number of cycles on that, they go back into the original key and close the song with another guitar part and a final reprise of the chant on synths. At 4 minutes something, it's a good tight tune, and was released as a single and performed pretty well, though I think the single version fades out during the chanting, the first set of chanting, and I kind of prefer that cut musically because it feels more natural to end it there with a fade out rather than the tacked on sounding studio outro on the album. Next we have Madrigal, introduced by Rick Wakeman playing on a Thomas Goff harpsichord. The song itself was conceived to be a madrigal, which is a type of song popular in the 16th century. Wakeman's harpsichord is beautiful throughout. It pulls back and simplifies when needed and adds more colorful runs when required to. 2. The singing and the melody is great, and I can get behind the lyrics. They're beautiful too. Steve comes in supporting the harpsichord with his own classy touches on his classical guitar. Rick and Steve complement each other really well here, both excelling in their abilities to sound like classical composers from hundreds of years ago. There's some very light, tinkly percussion here also, and what sounds like a faint bass pedal. Towards the climax, Wakeman goes on the trip and accomplishes some wonderful, pristine arpeggios. So fast. Chris and John fill in the space with angelic ahs in the background. Rick and Steve hold hands as they move through classical motifs once more to finish the song. It's less than 3 minutes, and it's well constructed and leaves a good impression. The mix and balance here is practically flawless, and the musicianship is excellent, and I'm wondering whether they used the mixes from the single versions rather than the album masters for Don't Kill the Whale and Madrigal. Next up is Release, Release. It kind of has a similar feel to the first track on the album, but much, much better. The opening is punchy, with an exciting guitar riff, I think playing in 4/4, and the drums and bass in 3/4, a kind of polyrhythm that, yes, on occasion employed. It is kind of a telltale stylistic trademark of an Alan White arrangement. The band sounds determined as they leap into the chorus of the song in 3/4, but without any singing yet. I'm really not digging the chord progression and mood of the chorus. The chords don't flow in a comfortable way for one, and the later introduction of the vocal melody only adds to my displeasure of it. Anyway, after they do the flash forward to the chorus, they launch into the verse section in 4/4 time now, and Steve Howe plays this rhythm guitar line that legit sounds like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. The vocals come in singing a melody based on counting in threes. It's really catchy and cool, and somewhat reminds me of the chorus melody from The Prophet off their second album. They go into a link segment between verse 1 and 2, and it's so damn funky. It develops this classical feel about it as bass and guitar play runs up and down together. It's such an invigorating little part. This album in general is a great display of Squire's bass prowess. He gets to fly around his bass neck so much on this record, probably producing the most extravagant bass lines on an NES record thus far. Verse 2 follows much like the previous one, thankfully, because I really wanted to hear that again. This is followed by a return of the opening polyrhythm section, but with added vocals, coming from Steve Howe and Chris Squire now. It's a nice fresh change to the feel of the band, and makes them seem more like a boy band, you know, with everyone taking turns at singing a line. Following the format of the intro, this is followed by the chorus, of course, now with added vocals. John is desperately trying to latch onto something here to make a melody stick, but it just sounds all over the place because the chord progression doesn't feel grounded and jumps around wildly with little reason to do so, leaving John to sing an odd melody and yelling out, "Release, release!" occasionally. Then the band crashes into an extended drum solo of all things, dominated by toms. It's decent enough, though apparently the music on its own in the section sounded too empty, so they inserted a recording of a cheering audience into the mix. Apparently it was from a football match, or soccer. Quick question, why do Americans call American rugby football? As White drums away, the music is further fleshed out with the introduction of shakers and a bitey guitar coming in for a run here and there, very relayer sounding. How then settles into a real, almost 60s sounding rhythm, completely out of the blue, but not unwelcome. They thankfully return to the verse section once more, and also we are met with another keyboard solo, displaying those new keyboards he was quite fond of at the time. If anything, those synthesizers would now be forever associated with Tormato, for better or worse. The whole piece all of a sudden gets its groove on, and drums and bass play a halftime funk beat, and there's no kind of about it, this is just funk. But it's somewhat ruined by the constant solo battle between Wakeman and Howe. It all culminates into a boop, and it's all over. The track's got a strong energetic feel to it. Some portions of it are probably among the highlights of the entire album, while the choruses especially lack a certain something, and could have been done in a different way, more tactfully. The mix though, some parts, especially the ending when things got musically quite dense and heated, it sounds just a tad wider than a mono recording in my opinion, and that's an issue that plagues most of the album really, and inadequate mastering and engineering I find can really make or break an album, no matter how good or bad the songs themselves are. If they sound great on the record, they will be perceived as better than they actually are sometimes, you know, if the mixing is top notch. Anyway, we'll try to move on. The next song is Arriving UFO, a curious little ditty. opens with a synth motif, a strange sounding alien-like voice perhaps. There's an instrument that comes in here and there to fill in the space of the main melody, and I can't tell what it is. It's running through a Leslie speaker and sounds so mangled that I can't tell whether that's Steve on guitar or Rick on a Hammond organ. The mood of the verses is quite chipper. The vocal line is pretty cool and covers a huge range from a very high start and skillfully traverses through the big expansive notes between the high beginning and the pretty low ending of each phrase, at the very limits of what John was capable of. It features some backwards reverbs of the first line of a new phrase that lead into the first line, you know? The lyrics are about a UFO encounter inspired by the Steven Spielberg movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which conjures up the now typical Anderson calls for unity and peace. The chorus suffers from the release plague of being vastly inferior to the verses. I mean, the verses aren't superb, but they ain't bad. The chorus is kind of boring, melodically and thematically. After a couple of couplets, we get into a new section taking on an ominous, commanding presence, with an odd choice of chords delivered forcefully by all involved. Like a depiction of an alien invasion, maybe. The invasion comes back later in the song, accompanied by the voice of an alien, I suppose, a bizarre effects-laden solo on a steel guitar. The sliding around allows Steve to mimic speech in a way. Maybe he's playing through a talk box or a vocoder-like deal and saying alien things. The music really achieves this movie soundtrack feel, and it climbs to a high point and bleeds into the opening alien synth loop again, which slowly grows in intensity to a spooky climax featuring alien foghorns and scary panning and swirling strings, maybe hinting at the possibility that the coming aliens won't be all that peaceful and that we as a human race can come together as one after all. The song sections and the instrumental parts of the song feel like they're not even part of the same track, and the mood keeps changing from the happy to the foreboding to the downright ridiculous, and it just leaves me confused as I listen to the timid opening of the next track, Circus of Heaven, a similarly celestial themed track which came from John's stint of writing children's songs. It's about a magical circus that came to a small town, and John basically sings about what they have on offer there, like fairies, unicorns, centaurs, elves, and so on. The beat is pretty relaxed throughout, mostly just a simple rhythm on triangle, and later on a kick drum on the third beat. Steve plays an echoey muted guitar accompaniment, while Chris experiments with a reggae-like bass rhythm, based on major triads. Some light organ work in there too. The melody itself is fine, but it's just a little repetitive, especially since the so-called verse section is repeated with no changes but a gradual instrumentation and vocal harmony build-up. But the magic kind of dissipates with a sudden change to a demented circus motif, led by a very excited keyboard locked in a manic frenzy. Then that just dies, and we get to this new, very empty-sounding, melancholy continuation of the description of the circus and its conclusion. Then the narrator, John, the singer, asks his son what he thought about it. And then his son, Damien, chimes in on the record, saying that it was okay, but it didn't have clowns or cotton candy or bouncy castles or anything that a real circus would have. And this just kind of bothers me a little bit in a chilling way. Like, this is a father and son talking about their experiences with a so-called Circus of Heaven? Are we sure that this is still on Earth? Because it almost makes it seem like they're dead and up in heaven and watching the heavenly equivalent of a circus. Anyway, this section gets really hauntingly beautiful in a way, with a soft playing from Steve Howe on electric guitar, and it's all ruined with the sudden return of the previous Carnival from Hell soundtrack. And then that fades away into a light synth rendition of the verse, and then that fades out as well. It's just another confused entry that doesn't really go anywhere. They had these ideas that just kind of slap together, and it's a really big dud. It's probably my least favorite track on the album. The penultimate track is Onward, solely written by Chris Squire. It's another soft-sounding song, but this time it's a more straightforward love ballad. It features a mix of a synth bass line while the real bass hangs low and plays chords occasionally. Guitar plays a beautiful recurring pattern, then later on travels to other instruments. The mix on this song is pretty much perfect. All the instruments are very clear and firmly sitting where they should be. But perhaps I was listening to an improved mix from a Yes compilation instead. Anderson's vocals feel a bit wavery in places, perhaps after a long singing session, or maybe because this was written by Squire himself, for himself. The melody is not in Anderson's comfortable range. The melody itself is fairly simple but sublime, especially in the chorus. Alan White is on vibes, making the track extra dreamy, and fuller too, considering that there isn't much happening in the rhythm section. A string section then comes in, a real one, orchestrated by Squire's friend Andrew Price Jackman. It sounds as it should, very professional, very expressive, and so far removed from the disaster of Time and a Word. For the second verse onward, there's a switchover of vocals, wherein Chris takes on the leading role, while John climbs on top of him to sing in harmony. Together, they make quite a pair. Pretty delivery, and powerful and passionate. There's a key change that welcomes a trombone solo following the verse melody closely, which leads to the final chorus, more passionate than ever and higher than ever. You know, you hardly ever hear a key change that goes down a step or so. So the conclusion of the song is full of wonder and dreams, and quite majestic due to the strings playing the guitar pattern now. It softly goes down step by step and slows down to the finish. It's a masterful composition. It's fairly simplistic, yet sophisticated, and performed great. Solid track. Though I feel the overall effect of listening to the album would have improved if Circus of Heaven and Onwards were kept further apart, since they both have a lot of air and are less active tracks. It will make Onwards more impactful, I'd say. The last track is On the Silent Wings of Freedom, which blasts into your eardrums from the very beginning, with basically a wah-wee bass solo assisted by the Mutron bass effect. The bass solo goes on for a while and it's quite melodic and virtuosic, at some points blasting out chunky chords at you. Alan is helping out, providing a dense shuffling beat, with intermittent appearances from guitars and keys coming in suddenly with a fast string of notes before dipping out again, like the prog rock flashes that they are. It's full of chaotic energy that reminds me of Soundchaser, like this is Chris's equivalent of Steve's guitar solo in that one. It goes on for so long, but is never boring, and even catchy at times, displaying great peaks and valleys of dynamic range. At around 2 minutes 30, guitar ushers in the slow release of the solo into the ether, and the arrival of the song proper at a crazy 2 minutes 40 seconds. On the silent wings of freedom! The bass remains pretty prominent in the arrangement due to the effect it has on it, chugging away, near quacking in the background. The guitar, though, is quite subdued in the verses, coming out for dreamlike forays of broken chords filled with chorus. There's some trumpet-like runs that come in and out of the arrangement, coming from the Byrotron, I presume. Squire goes nuts in the chorus, rises up and jumps down to play these fast runs. The melody of the chorus ain't great, it's not as powerful as the verses, again falling for the Tormato trademark, it seems, of having subpar choruses. The second verse offers a good change of musical density with a breakdown in the rhythm, and giving Anderson more room to stand out. And this reminds me of that arrangement trait from the olden days of Every Little Thing, and no opportunity necessary, no experience needed. There are these occasional appearances from a synth organ that sounds very tinny and has an almost 8-bit chiptune kind of quality. It's a bit distracting and out of place in the instrumentation. There's a great soft return to the opening bass solo section, with Alan filling up the sonic space with rolls on cymbals, and Rick chimes in with a synth string bed. There's lots of toothy flashing from Steve Howe's frantic guitar. Then there's a slow build-up to the final verse and chorus and the climactic finale of the album, with a cool keyboard solo which flows very well and very fast, full of expert playing, but even so feels a little empty due to all the instruments moving around so much. Great, fun ending though. So looking back, the band still had issues from the lack of a guiding light in an external producer, the same as the previous album, though they had different problems with this one. Whereas Going sounds too crowded from the reverb, as if, despite the members who disliked the use of reverb in that one, they said, you know what? You don't want reverb? Alright, this album has absolutely no reverb. And this results in a very flat, lifeless sound. Alan White's drums are just about as lifeless as someone using the top of a table as an impromptu drum kit. Furthermore, incompetent engineering only exacerbated the lifelessness of the mix. The songs are shorter and less proggy for sure, but by that time, prog was pretty much obsolete ever since the mid-1970s or so, with a large part of the rise in punk rock being a rebellion to the overcomplexity and grandiose stature of progressive rock. If you compare this to Close to the Edge, of course this falls short, but even though it's the same band, you're pretty much comparing very different styles that are probably going to appeal to different audiences. Of course, band disputes caused lots of the songs to not turn out perhaps as good as they could have. But if we look at the tracks for what they're meant to be, and see how many of them I think are at least good and above, you got Don't Kill the Whale, Madrigal, Release, Onwards, On the Silent Wings of Freedom. And just on this alone, it tops Going for the One. And even though the highs of Going are much higher than Tormato, overall, Tormato I found was a more enjoyable listening experience. It's more crisp and clear, despite it being a little dead. It's definitely a more rhythmically charged album rather than melodic, which was, I think, a huge fault in lots of the unmemorable choruses and Future Times Rejoice as a whole, which I have to rate a 5 out of 10 because it left me with absolutely no impression, positive or negative. So taking all things into account, weighing the positives and the negatives, Tormato gets a 6.4 out of 10. I'm still not praising Tormato because it still has a lot of problems and it ain't great, but I just want to give my true and honest opinion on the music, and I simply enjoy Tormato as a whole just a little bit more than Going. Given the choice between Going for the One and Tormato, if you put a gun to my head and shoot me with it, I would die. But if I had to choose an album to listen to as a whole, I would choose Tormato. Now, Tormato was released in September 1978 and was certified platinum by the RIAA. It wasn't as big as Going, but still not a dud either. The supporting tour was pretty huge, and they did a Yes in the Round set design, where they were in the middle of the venue on a circular stage that slowly rotated. Must have been an awesome experience. Shame that the existing footage is somehow even murkier in video and sound than Yes songs. Anyway, after a frigging 10-month-long tour, it was about time to go back into the studio and try to move past Tormato, which was seen by many, including the band, as a low point in their creative output. So tune in next Monday to see my hot take on their 10th studio album. Like and subscribe for more music reviews and original music. Special thanks to my patrons, and if you're interested in contributing, there's links to my Patreon and original music in the description below. Thanks again. See you around. Circus of Heaven came into town, surrounded by a millstone in a Midwestern town, waiting anxiously for the parade to begin all around, and the very last day. The penultimate track is Onward.